Hey guys, welcome back to Home Built, and I know I'm not Hoovy, but I did buy the cheapest Porsche 911 in the country. Hey guys, yes it is true, I did actually buy the cheapest Porsche 911 in the country, but I need to sort of caveat that it is actually the cheapest two-wheel drive, manual, hardtop Porsche 911 in the country. And this is it. It's my 1998 Porsche 911 C2. And I bought it without a PPI. Now, a lot of you are going to think I am mad, but let me just go through my reasoning here and the whole story of how this car came about. So, those of you who might have seen a previous video that I did, telling you that I actually wrote off my Audi S5. I hit a kangaroo. It looked like nothing damaged, but it actually wrote the whole car off. And that meant it was time to get a new car, and I wanted something a little bit different and something I can sort of work on with you guys, and this is what I came up with. I was actually contemplating getting a 997 911, but for almost double the money, it was a no-brainer. Really, for a very similar driving experience, I thought this is a good one. And everyone's scared of these things, so let's jump in feet first with no PPI. So why did I get it without a PPI? Well, basically, I'm not like a lot of buyers where I sort of analyze every car for sale for months and months. So the way I usually buy a car, I am a big one on reading the existing owner. And first of all, I just want to talk to them on the phone and get an idea of how they represent the car, how honest they are. Do they just talk about the good points, or do they talk about the are they honest with the bad points as well? I mean, not every second-hand car has got little things that aren't working on it. And the more honest you are with me, the more comfortable I feel with it. In this particular case, I had a good feeling from the owner. And one of the reasons why I didn't get a PPI is that the owner has had this car for about 18 months. And a guy that I've used for a previous PPI, and he's also highly recommended by other people in the Porsche community who I know, who highly recommend and trust him. He did the PPI on this 18 months earlier, and then subsequently did the services on it. And I asked him about the car, and it's, as he said, it's a good, honest car. He hadn't seen it for about 12 months, but I don't see anything super alarming on it in that time. So I was comfortable to go ahead and purchase this car, eyes wide open. It's not perfect, and let me just go through some of the good and bad points for you. So let me take you through some of the good bits about this car that I really liked when I first saw it. For starters are these wheels. These are, I believe, they're factory option wheels on the 996.2 cars, and I think these are one of the nicest factory wheels for this model of car that came out. So I really like the wheels, and these have some spaces front and rear, which just make the wheels fill out the guards nicely, and it makes it just look and sit really nice. You may also notice that it's a bit lower than standard because it has an H&R Cup Kit suspension upgrade on this, so it's a bit firmer than factory, but it's not teeth shattering. It's quite comfortable. I am not one for having super stiff cars. I find them really uncomfortable, and this is firm, but well and truly a comfortable and nice handling setup. So I'm quite happy with the suspension on this. So one of the other things I like about this car, has a BMC intake. I am not exactly sure on what's been done. Obviously, this has been changed and blocked off here. It may free up some horsepower, I don't know. Generally, these things don't free up a lot, but they generally sound a bit better, and yeah, it's a freer flowing system, so that's a nice thing. And while we're back here, I also would like to mention that this car has had the Gundo hack, or the Fister mod to the exhaust, which is, I highly recommend it to anyone who has a 996 or 997 911. I'll go into it more in another video, but basically it's sort of a bit of a bypass that makes the exhaust sound a lot throatier and gives it a much better sound without actually making it drone on the highway. It's just sort of, it's nice and pleasant. It doesn't deafen you, but when you get on it, particularly above sort of 5,000 RPM, oh, it really wails. It sounds great. Another thing that's been upgraded on this car that's not completely original is these early 98 models would have had the full fried egg headlights. So the bottom part here would have been orange. In this case, it's been upgraded to the slightly later version, which is clear. Same with the rear tail lights. The top half is clear, which I think works really well with the silver color on this car. I did actually get the original tail lights as well with the car, so I've got that, and also the factory original wheels, but I like it the way it is. And actually, these early headlights are really growing on me now. For a long time, I really didn't like these cars because of these headlights, because a lot of you, if you don't realise, this is the era that saved Porsche, where the front of this car is exactly the same as the Boxster. So basically everything up to the doors is the same. The dash is the same, all the panels are the same. The front bumpers are slightly different, but basically the whole front end is exactly the same as the Boxster. And one of the reasons they changed the headlights midway through the 996 period is because people were paying sort of double the money for a 911 and having this driving along the road, it looked the same as the much cheaper Boxster. So they made a bit of a different shape, sort of cut of the headlight on the later models. But to be honest, I actually prefer these headlights to the slightly later ones, particularly at least on the narrow body cars. On the turbos, I think they look really good, and the 4Ss, but on the narrow cars, I prefer these. So why was it so cheap? Well, one of the first things is the fact that it does have some of these modifications. So a lot of buyers want a completely factory original car that hasn't been touched at all. So to me, I don't think some of these mods are classed as highly modified. I see this as a very lightly modified car, but it still detracts from some buyers, so that can be a negative in some cases, even though a lot of these modifications were a very expensive thing to do, particularly the suspension modifications, etc. Another reason it was cheaper is because it has 147,000 kilometers on the clock. So, I mean, for a 21-year-old car, this is a 98 model, this is 2019, so it's not really that bad, but for a 911, it's higher. I think it's quite reasonable, and these things should be able to go for quite some time. But let's address the elephant in the room. This is the biggest thing that people are petrified about on these cars is the dreaded IMS bearing. And what is that, you ask? So basically the IMS is intermediate shaft. The intermediate shaft sits below the crankshaft in the engine, and there's a chain going from the crank down to the intermediate shaft, and then there's two chains going out to either side to the cams, and then another chain's going up to the top cam. So there's 4 cams on the engine, and they're all driven off of this intermediate shaft. And on these cars, the guys at Porsche changed, and this was a whole new engine, and basically what they did is they put a sealed bearing in the end of the intermediate shaft. So it's solid grease inside. It's supposed to be a bearing that will last forever, doesn't need any servicing. It's internally lubricated. It's just completely sealed. The issue is that if it ever does break down, if that bearing wears out and goes, then if the intermediate shaft moves, then basically the valves are free to hit pistons, and basically your whole engine explodes. So it's a horrible thing to happen, and a lot of people are absolutely petrified of this, and for good reason. I picture it a lot like asbestos. Now, bear with me. There are so many people who worked with asbestos for years and nothing ever happened to them. But the ones that did get asbestosis, it is the most horrible thing you could ever imagine, and it's a horrible, horrible death. And it's very, very similar with the IMS bearing. It is basically the asbestos of the cars, and roughly 1 in 20 cars had this issue, and the whole engines died. Now, thankfully, this is a 98 model, and I believe the first couple of years had the dual row IMS bearing, so this car being one of them, whereas the ones that had the most amount of issues were, I believe, sort of from the 01 to 04 cars that have the single row IMS bearing. So either way, it is something that has not been changed in this car. It is still running the original one, and it's something that can be monitored. So every time the oil's been changed in this car, basically they pull apart the oil filter and check to see if there's anything in there. if you change your oil frequently enough and keep an eye on it, you can sometimes get a bit of a hint. You can start seeing bits of metal flakes in the oil filter, and that will give you a good hint that the bearing might be going, so that's something to check. I will probably be doing the bearing in this car when I get around to doing a clutch, but there's lots of people who have had these cars running well over 200,000 kilometres on the original bearing and had no issues at all. So it's something that's in the back of my mind, but it's not keeping me up at night. I'm happy to drive the car and roll the dice, I suppose. So another one of the common issues with these 911s is the rear main seal leaking. And if you don't know what a rear main seal is, every engine pretty much has them on the end of the crankshaft where the flywheel bolts onto. There is a seal that goes around the edge that seals the crank to the engine to stop the oil coming out, and after a time these engines have a habit of the rear main seal leaking. It is not uncommon on a lot of cars. It's not just a 911 thing, it's just a car thing that rear main seals leak. The big issue with rear main seals leaking, they're not expensive, it's just a pain to fix it. Much like the intermediate shaft bearing, you need to pull the gearbox off to change it, and to do that then often you want to do the clutch at the same time. So with these cars, one of the common things is when you do a clutch, you do the rear main seal, and you do the IMS bearing. That is the common fix for these cars. This particular car has started to weep from the rear main seal. It's not a big deal if it does. You get a little bit of oil, a little spot of oil on the garage floor. As long as you make sure you monitor your oil levels, it's not a big deal. It's not going to be a terminal illness on your engine or anything like that. It's something that's very manageable, and it's something that I will fix on this car in good time. So some of the other things on this car, you can see there's some bug splatters here, but I don't know how well the camera's picking that up, but there's some cracks in the bumper here. I don't know whether it's sort of touched something before and it's cracked the paint. It's not a huge deal. And also there's a few stone chips and bits. It's not perfect. You know, they've sort of been touched up and a lot of them not too well. To be honest, I'm using this car as a daily driver, so I am not overly concerned about that. The other thing is it does actually have a dent in the door, just here. I don't know how well it's being picked up there, but there is a small dent in the door, so I'm going to look into repairing that dent. And also, there's actually also a dent here. This edge of the door looks like it's been opened into something and it's bent over. But the paint is not damaged in either case, so that will be a challenge for later on to try and repair. And that brings me into the interior of the car. Now, this has the grey leather interior, which is the lighter colours on these cars don't go as well, and particularly here you can see that the seat bolster is quite worn. It's not worn through, it's not damaged, but there are marks on the leather, and that's something that I can actually tackle and try and repair at a later stage. But it's all there. Another little thing is that the latch on this doesn't seem to catch anymore, so that's something that needs to be fixed. There's a bit of wear on this lever here for the bonnet and the boot, but an interesting thing is that on the Series 2 cars, they got rid of these manual levers and put in switches. The trouble is that if your battery goes flat, the electric switches don't work, and it's a real difficult thing to try and get into the engine bay to get to the battery because they don't work. There are little cables that are hidden up inside the wheel arches, apparently behind the lining, that you can pull to pop the boot or the bonnet, but they're difficult to get to, and sometimes when people have serviced cars, they're hidden away and you can't get into the battery. Another common problem is that the foam inside these vents that obviously seals things is deteriorating. I think it's a common problem with the cars of this age, and it's sort of blowing out of the vents. And periodically, since I've got the car, I've gone through and I got a little pick and I just pulled the foam out of the vents. It's annoying, but it's not the end of the world. And once the foam is all gone, yeah, it'll be, we will stop doing that and it'll be fine. But the aircon works fine, and everything else works nicely in this car. The only other thing is that over on this side, there's the little thing that holds these vents all in line has come unclipped from the back. it's in there, so I just need to pull this off and get in behind and re-clip all these vents back together again so that they all work as one. And one of the last challenges that I have with this car is that another very common problem on these cars is that the indicators do not self-cancel. Now, it's a common problem. I've had a look into it and I think there's a repair I can do, so keep an eye out for a future video on the repair on that. So time will tell whether I bought a lemon or I've bought the most underrated Porsche of all time. We will see, but I think I've done quite well. I'm really happy with this car. It drives great, it sounds great, and I'm looking forward to really getting to know it and really starting to push it. There's a lot of things I can do with this car that I'm going to take you guys along with. I am very inexperienced at the track. Did some drifting many years ago, but this is a car that I can actually do a couple of light track days with. It is going to be a daily driver, so Mrs. Jeff is going to drive it to work, but it's just the new car that's coming around, and hopefully you guys can come along and see that these things are actually quite underrated, and I think they're a bargain now at the prices that they're going for. So yeah, I hope you guys join me for the ride. As always, please like, subscribe, comment. Let me know if I'm a moron or whether you think I've done the right thing. And we'll see you on the next one. All right, guys. See you later.